This is Chapter 12, The New Imperialism, Discussion Number 3, Chinese Nationalism Challenged by the West. If you think back to the earlier chapters, we talked about how China and Japan were starting to restrict who would trade with them and when they would trade with them because they were afraid of what the European culture and the European ideas would do to their mighty nations of China and Japan. And so China has continued those huge restrictions on foreign trade. However, the British merchants, just like any other country which has a high amount of restriction on what can be traded, there was a lot of black marketing going on. And the black merchants were sneaking into China and selling the Chinese opium, which is the progenitor for heroin, which hopefully all of you realize is illegal and extremely addictive drug. Now, what the British were doing is that instead of using gold or any other type of medium of exchange, is that they were getting the opium from India, and then they would be taking the opium and then they'd take it to China, get a huge amount of exchange for opium for tea, and then they'd take the tea back to Britain. And so this turned out to be another highly lucrative trade route for the British. However, the Chinese weren't exactly very in favor of it. While the local Chinese, the ones who were using it, were addicted to heroin and kept on wanting it, the Chinese government said, "You need to stop, you're destroying our people." And Britain goes, "Now wait a minute, we want to do this business, you try to stop us." Great Britain literally declared war, the Opium Wars, in order for the right to give heroin to the Chinese. And they won. The British industrial weaponry made it a fairly easy victory versus the Chinese, who were still dealing, while they had invented gunpowder, they hadn't come up with as effective ways to use it in military efforts, and so China pretty much got overwhelmed. Now, when Britain won the Opium War, they got several different ideas out of it and forced China to essentially do things their way. First of all, British imposed a huge indemnity. Now, what is an indemnity, though? An indemnity is essentially a fee charged by a winning country on a losing country, saying, these are our damages during the war that you lost, you have to pay them. They also seized the island of Hong Kong, and out of their kindness, they forced China to sign a 99-year lease on the island of Hong Kong. And they said in 99 years we'll renew it. Well, when 1997 came around and the 99-year lease was up, China said forget about it, and they took Hong Kong back. However, also what happened is that Britain took a map of China and said these are the areas where if a British person is in China, they will live according to British law, not Chinese law. This idea was called extraterritoriality. And as China was learning that they were getting pushed around by the British, other European powers, and the United States was kind of wishing it got in on this as well, started carving out their spheres of influence in China where they controlled who would come in for business and who would not, and whether it be by working with the local warlords or putting in their own military presence or naval presence in the area to make sure that they were the only ones that were dealing there. And so we have a lot of Europeans taking China and carving up into little pieces and turning it into their own little fiefdoms, following the British example. Now, China's not exactly in favor of that, and a lot of the population was getting tired of being pushed around by the Europeans, and then having a lot of the Chinese trying to become European to get along with essentially with the new power, instead of those trying to fight for the Chinese identity and culture. There's a group of Chinese nationalists they kind of came up with a name that, when it's translated into English, essentially says the righteous harmonious fists. And they rebelled against these Western intrusions into the Chinese way of life because they ignored Chinese laws. The industrialization was taking away Chinese traditions and Chinese way of life, and Chinese jobs for these traditions were being taken over. And so these righteous harmonious fists, where we get the term Boxer Rebellion, attacked foreigners all over China in a concentrated and organized, orchestrated idea, and took thousands of Europeans captive and held them up for ransom to essentially get the Europeans kicked out. Now, so did the Western Europeans and the Americans just roll over and say, okay, we'll leave? No. They all sent their militaries over. There were several military operations. Almost all of the hostages were freed, and they actually were able to take Beijing back from these righteous, harmonious fists and reestablish the way that they had done things. But China's not just going to roll over. They just couldn't have the what they needed in order to take over their own country. However, the Chinese nationalism got a new leader by the name of Sun Yat-sen. You see there's two different spellings on there. We could get into a long discussion. I believe that there are three official ways to take Chinese names which are not written in our letter language and then transfer them over. When I came up in high school, the one part that's in parentheses, that's how I learned how to spell the guy's name. The one on the left is the way that your textbook spells the name. So take which one. I've always pronounced it Sun Yat-sen. Anyway, he led a movement of Chinese nationalists in the early 1900s because the Chinese emperor was not holding things together. Again, all the local warlords and all the local powers who were playing favorites with all the Europeans, getting what they wanted to as far as military protection, commercial benefits, and they were all acting for themselves instead of acting for China. But Dr. Sun Yat-sen was able to essentially start to get a Chinese nationalist identity together and calling everyone together. And he had three basic principles: the idea of nationalism, that we are China, we have a way of doing things in China, and these are right for China. The idea of democracy, that everyone has value and ought to be a part of it, and then economic security for all Chinese. Now, the definition of economic security is going to be highly important when we get to right before World War II, when the Kuomintang, which is the Chinese nationalists that were being led by Sun Yat-sen, are going to have two different leaders with two different interpretations. One is going to say some type of capitalism, which would be led by Chiang Kai-shek, and then there's going to be another one who's going to say that economic security for all Chinese means communism, and that group is being led by Mao Zedong. So that kind of gets us a little bit through the late 1800s, early 1900s, and what's going on in China. This concludes discussion number 3, Chinese nationalism challenged by the West, as part of Chapter 12, The New Imperialism.